Okay, so when you think ancient Egypt, you probably picture pyramids, pharaohs, the Nile. But what if I told you there's this whole other layer? A really significant, long-lasting Libyan presence woven right into Egyptian society for, well, millennia, even before the periods we usually study.
Yeah, it's a fascinating angle, and actually that's exactly what we're diving into today. We're looking at a source one of you listeners sent in an academic paper from the African Journal of Advanced Studies in Humanities and Social Sciences.
Right. And the title is The Libyan Presence in the Region of Oxyrhynchus During the Ptolemaic and Roman Periods, an analytical study based on papyrus documents.
Quite a mouthful, but it tells you what it's about.
Okay, so the source itself, what are we working with here? The authors are using historical analysis, right?
Exactly. They're drawing heavily on papyrus documents, thousands of them, found in the Oxyrhynchus region that's modern Banasa in Egypt.
Wow, okay.
But it's not just papyri. They also loop in much older Egyptian inscriptions, writings from classical guys like Herodotus, Strabo, and modern historical research, too. It's quite comprehensive.
So, quite a mix of evidence. And our mission today, what are we trying to get out of this?
Well, we want to follow their analysis, really understand what this Libyan presence in Oxyrhynchus looked like during the Ptolemaic and Roman times. How extensive was it? What were they doing there?
And what does it tell us about maybe how connected the ancient world actually was?
Precisely. We're looking for those surprising details, the key takeaways that kind of flesh out our understanding beyond the usual narratives.
Okay, so the paper makes it clear this isn't just a Ptolemaic or Roman thing. This interaction between Egypt and Libya goes way, way back.
Oh, absolutely. Long before, you have this long history, sometimes conflict, sure, but also periods of significant settlement, Libyans moving into Egypt.
And the early Egyptian records, they actually name different Libyan groups.
They distinguish between them. You get names like the Tehenu, the Temhu, the Ligu, or sometimes Ribu, and the Meshwesh. These weren't just lumped together as Libyans.
So what were the differences? Did the Egyptians describe them?
They did. The Tehenu, for instance, often shown tall, dark-skinned, long black hair. Pretty clear visual markers.
Okay.
But then you have the Temu, sometimes described with fairer skin, maybe even blonde or red hair, blue eyes, which is, quite striking.
Wow. Yeah, that definitely challenges the simple picture.
It really does. And later, the Libu and then the Meshwesh become more prominent. The Meshwesh especially become really important in the Egyptian military.
So this wasn't just raiding parties coming across the border. There was real integration happening.
For sure. We see evidence of Libyans in positions of power back in the Ramesside period, that's New Kingdom Egypt. And there are hints, strong suggestions even, of Libyan ancestry in later dynasties, like with Oxyrhynchus.
So assimilation over quite a long time.
Exactly. It indicates a deep, ongoing interaction.
And where in Egypt were these early Libyan communities settling? Was it just on the western edge?
Well, the western desert oases, certainly Siwa, Baharia, Farafra, Dakhla, Karga, those were key areas. But also the delta, places like Mariotis, Nabis, the Fayum region, and even settling along the Nile Valley itself.
So pretty widespread then.
It paints a picture of Libyan communities dotted across various parts of Egypt, not just isolated pockets. There's even this idea the paper mentions that folks in the Western Delta might have identified more as Libyan than Egyptian until maybe the 5th century BCE.
That's fascinating and really makes you think about identity back then.
And the Baharia Oasis is a great example of this early presence.
Yeah.
The paper points to a stela from Sheshonq-Thiant's time found there.
A stela being like an inscribed stone slab.
Yeah, exactly. And you find local governors in Baharia with clear Libyan names and origins. Weatidin, this family of Arewa and Kansuifang. These weren't outsiders just passing through. Plus, you had established routes connecting Baharia to Oxyrhynchus and the Fayum. They even found Libyan inscriptions along one of those routes. It shows ongoing contact.
And this movement continued, didn't it? Later groups settling.
Yes. The Ribu settled more in the western delta, and the Meshwesh, as we mentioned, eventually gained significant control in parts of the Nile Valley, deeply integrating into the army. It's this constant ebb and flow.
Is there any connection between these ancient Egyptian names for Libyan tribes and the ones we know from, say, Greek and Roman sources?
There are theories, yeah. The paper touches on links, like the Tehinu possibly being related to the later Adermarchidae known to the Greeks. It leads to this concept some scholars used Libya Egyptians.
Libya Egyptians, a blend of cultures.
Sort of reflecting that deep, long-term mixing of populations and cultures.
And these Libyans, they weren't just living alongside Egyptians, they got involved in the politics too.
Oh, definitely. They weren't passive bystanders. The paper gives examples. King Apries, asking for Libyan help against Cyrene, later an alliance with Cyrene under Amasis II, and a major revolt against Persian rule led by a Libyan named Inaros. They were players on the historical stage.
Okay, so that sets the scene. A long, complex history. Now let's jump forward to the Ptolemaic period after Alexander the Great. The paper says Oxyrhynchus becomes a key spot for Libyans. Why there?
Good question. Location probably played a big part. Oxyrhynchus is on the Nile's west bank, relatively close, geographically, to Cyrenaica, that region in modern Libya with Greek cities.
Okay, so a natural point of contact.
Seems likely. And maybe those older connections via places like Baharia helped too. We start seeing evidence in the papyri for both civilians and military people from Cyrenaica settling in Oxyrhynchus.
Ah, the papyri. So what do they actually tell us? What were Libyans doing there day to day?
Well, a lot of it points to agriculture. We find these lease contracts, actual documents showing Libyans, and they're often identified specifically, like from Cyrene or from Barca leasing farmland.
Really? So they're farming?
Yeah. Names like Neoptolemus, Eupoles, Apollonius Hesperites, these guys are signing contracts to farmland, sometimes confiscated land, sometimes undeveloped plots. They're growing wheat, barley, investing in the local economy.
That's pretty concrete evidence.
It is. And then there's the military side, which seems really significant too.
Right. You mentioned military personnel.
Yes, it looks like a good chunk of the Ptolemaic armies stationed around Oxyrhynchus actually came from Cyrenaica. The papyri mention Libyans holding ranks like idiots or Decanicus.
Sorry, what ranks are those?
Idiots might mean something like a private soldier, and Decanicus may be a leader of 10, sort of lower to mid-level military roles. They're serving in specific units under named commanders. So a real presence in the garrison.
And didn't military service often come with land?
Exactly. That was a key perk in the Ptolemaic system. Soldiers often received land grants, called kleroi. So serving in the army was a direct route for Libyans to get land and put down roots in the Oxyrhynchus area.
And build families.
Yes, and we even see mentions in the papyri of Egyptian women marrying men from Cyrene. So those social ties were forming too, blending the populations.
So lands, military, what else? Were they involved in the town's finances?
Seems so. The papyri show evidence of tax payments like a Theodorus, son of Callicrates, paying a grazing tax, the Anamian.
Okay.
And not just paying taxes, but collecting them too. There's mention of people from a place called Tholthius involved in tax collection, and even lending money.
Lending money.
Yeah, we have a record of a Theodo, daughter of Leon of Cyrene, lending money to someone named Xenion. Another case involves a Demetria from Cyrene lending money with collateral. Get this, a bird tower.
A bird tower as collateral. That's specific.
Isn't it? It just shows they were part of the everyday financial transactions of the community.
It's interesting how they're often identified by their city, from Cyrene, from Barca, Hesperites.
Yeah, that's a key point about identity. It suggests that even while living and integrating into Oxyrhynchus, they maintained a connection, a sense of origin tied back to their Libyan or Cyrenaican hometowns.
So maybe not fully assimilating in the sense of losing their old identity.
Perhaps navigating a kind of dual identity. They're part of Oxyrhynchus, but they're also from Cyrene. It's complex.
Okay, so that's the Ptolemaic era. What happens when Rome takes over Egypt? Does this Libyan community fade away?
Doesn't look like it, based on the paper's analysis of the Roman-era papyri. Libyans seem to remain an important part of the social mix in Oxyrhynchus.
Still integrated.
Yeah. We get glimpses. There's an example of an Apollonius, specifically called the Libyan, involved in collecting rent in a village near Oxyrhynchus called Tacona.
Okay, so still involved in local economics.
Right. And maybe even more telling is a case about a Libyan woman who needed official permission to bury her husband.
What's significant about that?
The key thing is how she was treated. The process she went through seems to be the standard, normal administrative procedure in Roman Oxyrhynchus. There's no indication she was treated differently because she was Libyan. It implies, well, a certain accepted status.
Equal standing, perhaps, in that context.
It certainly points that way, yeah. Equal standing under the local administration, at least for that kind of process.
And there was a court case mentioned, too.
Yes, a really interesting one involving a man named Syros, identified in the court documents as being of Libyan origin, and an Egyptian woman, Amoitos.
What was the dispute?
Syros was accused of seizing property that Amoitos claimed was hers. His Libyan background is explicitly noted in the record.
So how did the court handle that? Did his origin matter?
Well, what's crucial is the process. The Roman authorities basically said, okay, before we rule, we need proof of ownership. They demanded evidence.
Standard legal procedure.
Exactly. Syros, despite being identified as Libyan, was subject to the same legal demands and burden of proof as anyone else would be. It really highlights that Libyans living there were functioning within the Roman legal system of Egypt.
Okay, so let's try and pull this all together. As we wrap up this deep dive, what are the big takeaways from this research on Libyans in Oxyrhynchus?
Well, first, this Libyan presence in Egypt isn't new or temporary, it's ancient, stretching back millennia. Second, during the Ptolemaic and Roman period specifically, Oxyrhynchus was a significant hub for Libyans.
Right.
They were active in agriculture, in the military, and local finances, really embedded in the region's life. And third, the evidence, especially from the Roman period, points towards a pretty high degree of integration into the social and, importantly, the legal structures. These seem to have been harshly treated like other inhabitants.
Was there anything in the paper that particularly surprised you or maybe challenged a common assumption?
I think those early Egyptian descriptions, especially the Temhu potentially having fair features, that's quite counterintuitive to the standard imagery. And just the sheer level of detail we get about their economic and legal lives from these scraps of papyrus.
It's amazing what survived.
It really is. It shows they weren't just a marginal group. They were, woven into the very fabric of that society in Oxyrhynchus.
So thinking bigger picture, what does this specific case study tell us about the ancient Mediterranean world more broadly?
I think it really underscores how interconnected these societies were. It wasn't just empires conquering. It was people moving, cultures mixing, identities shifting, and becoming more complex.
Fluid boundaries.
Yeah, much more fluid than we sometimes imagine. People, goods, ideas, they were moving constantly. The Libyans in Egypt are a fantastic case study of that ancient dynamism.
Okay, so a final thought to leave our listeners with, something to chew on.
Well, thinking about this deep integration over centuries, maybe the question is, how did this continuous Libyan presence actually shape the culture of Oxyrhynchus and nearby areas in ways we haven't even fully recognized yet?
Subtle influences, maybe?
Could be. And it makes you wonder what other stories are still hidden in those thousands of unread papyrus fragments. Stories of other groups, other interactions that could give us an even richer, more diverse picture of the ancient world. It's a reminder, really, to look for those voices that history often overlooks.